We're thrilled to have back with us today Dr. John J. Navin. This is his third time. He's done he's done two Talking History series with us before, and so we'll keep having him as long as he'll keep coming, because he does a wonderful job, ever popular. John has been, is this your 25th year at Coastal Carolina University? So 25th anniversary, that's pretty big. And he is originally from Boston, so you might hear a trace of that Boston accent in his voice. John Navin is professor of history at Coastal Carolina University. As we said, been there for a long haul. He's not a short timer, to play on the Vietnam, our subject today, Vietnam War lingo. He's in for the long haul. He got his PhD at Brandeis University, where he taught before coming to Coastal, great school up there, up north. He specializes in early American history, and his publications focus on race, warfare, gender, and the impact of colonizing ventures on groups and individuals. His recent book, The Grim Years, Settling South Carolina, 1617 to 1720, came out from the University of South Carolina Press in 2019. And he gave a talk on that was wonderful here. That was to kick off our collaboration with Coastal Carolina University, the Talking History series. And you may have heard John on the radio talking with Walter Edgar's Journal about that book. But that's a book well worth checking out, either in the library or getting your own copy. But a great early history of South Carolina. There was a lot of grimness there that John goes into, all the struggles that were faced there. Before, this is interesting, a lot of academics were one-trick ponies, that's all we can do. Not John. Before completing his doctorate, he managed the communications department for several Massachusetts firms, and he holds 2 U.S. patents for four-way chess. So that's pretty good. So he can give us some chess tips as well. He often teaches courses on Vietnam, and that's where this talk comes from today. And I'll also say his daughter, Sarah Navin, she's established herself as one of a leading graphic narrative artist. She's very talented, and she's got a great following out there. And she also has a first novel. Is it out yet, or it's coming? In the works, coming out from Tin House, which is, that's a writer's venue. So that's, she's done well, and I think John's, his other half, I won't say they're equal halves, is here well, so they can share in that accomplishment as well. So we want to say thanks and welcome John in, and thanks to our FAL members. I see Diane Stern, our president, here today with us for hosting this series and having the first Thursday here. If you're not a member of FAL, please join in. But let's welcome Dr. John Navin today. Thank you, John.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I asked Karen to come with me, and I said, you might be half the audience, Dan will be the other half. On a cold January morning, I didn't know what to expect. My daughter is up in Maine, so she's got it even colder than we do, but she's relishing it up there. One thing about living up in a climate like that, I lived in Maine for 7 years or so, that's where I met Karen. It's so darn cold, it kills the germs, so you tend to be healthier than you are down here, and South Carolina's history is full of disease, and I think everybody talks about the heat, and those two are associated with each other. Let me start by saying what this is not going to be today. This is not a Vietnam vet talking about his direct knowledge or his reminiscences of his time in service. I am sure we have some Vietnam veterans here today. Could I see some hands? 3, 4. So thank you for your service. Okay. While these gentlemen were over in Southeast Asia, I was most likely in a classroom in Boston. I was at the University of Massachusetts in Boston from 1968 to 1972, which, if you know anything about the Vietnam War, was a very good time to be in a classroom in Boston. And so what I'm here to do today, and what I do in my Vietnam class at Coastal, is I try to help students and people I speak to understand the war, get a better perspective on it. I am not going to be able to tell you what it was like to be slogging through the jungles of Vietnam. There are people here in this room who can do that, and I would be ashamed if anybody would go away thinking that I'm here trying to talk about my experience. No, I'm talking about what I've learned about their experience. So that being said, let's move on. One thing that I find when I teach the course on Vietnam at Coastal, and I have visitors who are veterans, one thing I find talking to them and to just general groups at public talks when veterans attend is that a lot of times, even people who serve in Vietnam didn't get the whole story. They know what they experienced. They know what they lived. But there may have been things about this whole war or about the causes of this war that maybe some of those details, those blanks, get filled in. I think if somebody were to ask me encapsulate what you're going to say, what's your summary on this war? One thing that I tell my students who are 18 to 21-year-olds, I say, at the time, this was a war that we thought was a good war, a just war. And over time, many people in the nation lost that feeling, that view. Our sense of what was happening and why it was happening changed during the war. And so rather than talk about that directly, I'm going to walk you through it the way I walk through the war, if you will, and the coming of war with my students. But before I even change one slide, I want to take a moment just to not only thank you for being here, but to thank the Friends of the Waccamaw Library for having me here. This is, as Dan said, my third time here, and it's always a pleasure. I appreciate Dan reaching out. Dan and I are old colleagues. He mentioned I've been at Coastal for a long time. Well, that means I've known Dan for a long time. And as Director of Programming and Outreach, I can tell you he's doing a fine job for you folks down here. And I also want to mention that I have a colleague in the room, Scott Heilman. Scott, where are you hiding now? Oh, back in the very corner. Like so many of my students, always trying to hide in the back row. And Scott actually knows far more than I do about the early years of the war involving the French. And I think because we'll be on a fairly tight schedule once I get going here, I don't know that you'll get to hear from Scott today, but certainly he's here, and he's somebody that if you have questions, you might direct some of those to him. So let's get started. We're going to be talking about Vietnam during a time of change. You see on the left, this is Indochina during the war and during early French rule. I shouldn't say early French rule, actually this would be later French rule. Then you'll see in the middle we have what would be kind of the war years, and then we see the unified Vietnam afterward. So this is a changing landscape, and during this war, the neighboring countries, Laos and Cambodia, are going to play in important ways as well. French involvement in Vietnam started back in the mid-19th century when the French came in during the period of empire building, and the French weren't the only ones to be working on expanding their empire, but they came into Vietnam arguing that Christians were being persecuted. And that was their pretext to come in, and that was the beginning of colonial rule back in 1858. So we refer to Southeast Asia, much of it as French Indochina as a result of their involvement. Their mission civilisatrice, excuse my French, I'm 100% Irish, was a period of brutal regime. You can see from some of these photos, and I'm sorry, sometimes you show photos that are very upsetting, and this is one that on the national news they'd say there'll be disturbing images. You can see that there was brutality going on, and certainly the French were in there as the dominant, the conquering group, if you will, and the Vietnamese were suffering under their rule. The French were there, as you might expect, to make a profit. The whole colonial process is basically reaching out, seizing lands, seizing peoples, and exploiting them for the good of the home country, even if it means it's an adverse situation for those people. Now, Ho Chi Minh is obviously a central figure to this whole story. And here's where we might start with people who just have a vague or faint acquaintance with the war. We know Ho Chi Minh as the leader of the bad guys, if you will. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the communist forces that ultimately drove us out or caused us to withdraw on our own terms. Ho Chi Minh wanted nothing more as a young man than to have his country unified and to do what he thought best for the Vietnamese. So you see these different pictures. Ho Chi Minh in 1921 is a young man who's trying to basically act as an unofficial or unappointed diplomat for Vietnam, for the people of Vietnam. This is in the wake of the First World War, when major powers are dividing up the world to some degree. And he is there to speak on behalf of his people, of his country. And when I say there, he goes to Paris. The second picture you're going to see is taken when he was in prison in Hong Kong for his involvement with the Communist Party. And then the Ho Chi Minh you're more familiar with, shown in his jungle fatigues in 1946. During the Second World War, or at the end of it. Okay. The Paris Peace Conference is that event in France that was going on when, after the First World War, major representatives from major powers were redrawing maps. And one of the reasons, or the reason that Ho Chi Minh was in Paris was to try and get some of these people to listen to him and to recognize the sovereignty of the people of Vietnam, their right to self-rule. He was affiliated with the Communist Party, but he was not there on behalf of the Communist Party. He was there on behalf of the people of Vietnam, though he certainly had communist leanings in terms of his politics. So in 1930, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party formed, and he was central in that process. During the Second World War, Vietnam underwent a very difficult period of occupation under the Japanese between 1940 and 1945. And if you know any of the stories of the Japanese occupation in China and Vietnam and other countries, it could be very brutal. Japanese showed disdain for people and for human life. And so there were numerous atrocities committed in many countries by the Japanese. So this was a period of foreign rule, Japanese rule, during which the Vietnamese were rising up against their oppressors. Now, mind you, their oppressors prior to this would have been the French. But the French, during the Second World War, were no longer in control. The Japanese were. And this is when Ho Chi Minh becomes active in leading the resistance against the Japanese. You can see there's a National Independence Coalition founded in 1941. It is backed by this Indo-Chinese Communist Party, of which he is a part. But they were the principal forces in battling the Japanese occupiers. So at that point, we would consider Ho Chi Minh and his followers to be allies of the United States and the Allied cause. Having a little trouble with our clicker here, Dan. Okay. Here, just as an example of that, here are OSS. This is the early version of the CIA. Okay? Here's the United States OSS team members posing with Ho Chi Minh and Giap, who will become the military leader, the real brains behind the North Vietnamese army. And here are men with them and their men meeting in August of 1945. We clearly looked at them as allies during this period. Here's President Roosevelt, before his death, giving his opinion, obviously close to his death, giving his opinion on Vietnam. Looking at what would happen after the war, Indochina should not go back to France. France has had the country 30 million inhabitants for nearly 100 years, and the people are worse off than they were at the beginning. I am wholeheartedly supported in this view by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and Marshal Stalin. The case of Indochina is perfectly clear. France has milked it for 100 years. The people of Indochina are entitled to something better than that. Now, the French have not ruled during the war years. The prospect here is the Japanese are on the losing side. They're going to be driven out. What's going to happen in Vietnam? And this is a moment of opportunity. This is the moment at which the Vietnamese could gain self-rule, could gain their independence, be free of the Japanese, and the French have already been driven out. So this was their moment, and again, they are our allies. Now here you might start to have opinions about the French. Excuse me to anybody in here who's French, but there's General de Gaulle. We do not understand your policy. This is the policy of arguing that the Vietnamese should be left alone, should not be subject to recolonization or to colonial rule by any power, that they should be basically given the chance to become independent. What are you driving at? Do you want us to become, for example, one of the federated states under the Russian aegis? If the public here comes to realize you are against us in Indochina, there will be terrific disappointment, and nobody knows to what that will lead. We do not want to become communist. We do not want to fall into the Russian orbit, but I hope that you do not push us into it. Well, this sounds an awful lot like extortion or extreme coercion on the French part, saying, we want to go back into Southeast Asia. We want Vietnam back. And if you stop us from doing that, well, watch out. You know, those communists, they're all over the place, and we might become the next communist nation. Here at the Potsdam Conference, a famous conference in 1945, France requests the return of all pre-war colonies in Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And the United States agrees to that. The folks in Vietnam didn't agree to that, and Ho Chi Minh, again, is behind, he's the driving force behind this movement. This is their declaration of proclamation of independence. All people are created equal, endowed by their creator with inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That sounds pretty familiar, right? We know who they're modeling that over. Vietnam has the right to be a free and independent country, and in fact is so already. So this is our ally trying to claim the same rights that we claimed. And we've just said to the French, we're not going to try to stop you from going back in. We're not going to help you, but we're not going to do anything to stop you, which is a change from what FDR had been saying. Now, FDR has passed on, and Truman wavers further on the policy. The U.S. has no thought of opposing the reestablishment of French control in Indochina. It's not the policy of this government to assist the French or to reestablish their control by force. So now you'll have war resume in Indochina, and we're talking here particularly in Vietnam, where the French are trying to regain control, and the United States is willing to stand by. And we might ask, why this change in policy? Why is the United States willing to let this happen to a company that we seemed to be close allies with? Well, let's look at this slide. What else is going on in the world during this period? 1945, Korea is divided at the 38th parallel. 1946, it's divided between US and USSR, Russian forces. 46, Stalin declares communism and capitalism incompatible. This is where Churchill introduces the idea of the Iron Curtain. 48, the Soviets invade Czechoslovakia. 49, the Soviets test their first atomic bomb, beginning the nuclear arms race, right? 1949, the Chinese Communist Revolution, led by Chairman Mao, creating the People's Republic of China. Now we have a situation where the Americans Party, the Democratic Party, is going to be blamed for losing China. The communists have gained China, okay, under democratic rule in the United States. And so what we're going to see is with Eisenhower, the switch to Republican rule, the Republicans don't want to lose Vietnam as the Democrats lost China. That's going to be something you'll see over and over in the language back then. So 1950, McCarthy begins the communist witch hunt. In 1950, North Korea invades South Korea to establish a communist regime. So this is also going on in addition to all these things about Vietnam in particular. So in other words, the Cold War has begun, and the communist threat is greatly expanding, and the communists themselves have announced that communism and capitalism are incompatible. So the idea of global domination being a goal of the communists has become very real. The Pentagon Papers, the record shows through 1953, the French pursued a policy based on military victory, excluded meaningful negotiations with Ho Chi Minh. So there's no talk here of working out some deal with Ho Chi Minh. The French want control, and the United States now has another reason to be not just standing back, but actually contributing to the French cause. Washington, again, this is the Pentagon Papers, Washington wanted France to fight the anti-communist war and win, preferably with US guidance and advice. Washington, seems so naive, expected the French, when battlefield victory was assured, to magnanimously withdraw from Indochina, which is crazy. Go in, shed the blood, spend the money to recapture it, and then step away. That, you can just wonder what people were thinking, that they would argue that. But the point before that is a very important one. Basically, we want the French to be our proxy in the battle against the communists. We don't want to see the communists take over Southeast Asia. But we don't want to go in there and fight them on the ground. Let the French do that. And so to that end, we will start to support the French militarily with money, not with men, but with supplies and money. Eisenhower, you have the row of dominoes set up, and I think probably everybody in this room knows this story. When the first one goes, then another, and another. Asia has already lost 450 million of its people to the communist dictatorship. We simply can't afford greater losses. The Pentagon Papers, Secretary Dulles made it clear he would not permit the loss of Indochina in the manner the Democrats had allowed the loss of China. Okay. He wanted China not to intervene, but look at the last line. Dulles was opposed to a ceasefire and tried to dissuade the French from negotiations with the Viet Minh, which are the fighters under Ho Chi Minh. So if I just stopped right here and went home and said, so what have you learned so far? I think it's that the Vietnamese were looking for independence, were looking for self-rule. The French wanted to come in and exploit them as they had in the past, and now layered on top of that is this communist threat, and we're going to support the French because they are the anti-communist forces in Vietnam. But the French aren't going to last. This is where I wish I had time to bring Scott Heilman up, because he could tell you all about this phase and the phase I've been talking about. The French will lose after a masterful military operation from March to May in 1954, and the great, well, depending on which side you're on, the terrible Battle of Dien Bien Phu is a total victory for Ho Chi Minh and his forces, his Viet Minh forces, and the French are going to be forced to withdraw. At the Geneva Conference, following the defeat of the French, Vietnam will be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. There will be national elections scheduled in 1956. Aha, here's another moment. Here's a moment. Now, after the Second World War, there was a moment when the Vietnamese were saying, we want, at least some portion of them, and Ho Chi Minh certainly was saying, we want self-rule, we want independence, and that was denied them. Now here's a moment, national elections to be held in 1956. And so these accords are going to allow for basically democratic rule in Vietnam. There is oppression that goes on in the north. The communist forces, the Viet Minh, okay, start to take greater control and to punish, to jail, even to kill their opponents. And so there's a stream of migrants, particularly Catholics, from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. Something our press wouldn't have talked about as much is there's also a stream of people from South Vietnam to North Vietnam. So there's people going both ways depending on their political persuasion and how safe they felt or how fearful they were for their lives. And we took part in helping move those people. So this is the man who we think should be in charge in South Vietnam. He will uphold our goals, what we're looking to accomplish. And this is Diem. He will assume the role of prime minister, and we will begin to ship lots of money and military aid to him. And so the first Americans who are sent over as advisors, the first ones to be killed will be in these two killed in a terrorist attack. This is 1958, I believe. So we're getting involved very slowly. First it's money, it's military goods, and now starting to send advisors over. 1960s, Diem cracks down on the opposition, driving more people to North Vietnam. The draft conscription is imposed, and Hanoi establishes a communist political organization, the National Liberation Front. The strategic Hamlet program begins the next year. Khrushchev, on behalf of Russia, pledges support for wars of national liberation. So now you've got the communists, the Russians supporting North Vietnam. We're supporting South Vietnam. JFK starts sending Green Beret advisors to South Vietnam. And McNamara starts proposing to send troops over. One thing I skipped over, one of the lines, was that election that was supposed to take place in '56 did not take place, and that was more on us than on the opposing side, because we knew that Ho Chi Minh would win in an open election. And so instead, we preferred to have Diem in control. So in 1962, we start to bomb Viet Cong-controlled hamlets, and there's joint declarations on the neutrality of Laos, which for those in here who served, you know how important this turns out to be. It means that the Ho Chi Minh Trail can go through an adjoining country, a neighboring country, and we can't touch it. At least officially, openly, we can't go after people using that trail. And so large Viet Cong units start to form in central Vietnam. And McNamara, this is the first time, 62, they start to report, we're winning this war. 63, you may remember from things like Life magazine, the Buddhist protests going on in Saigon. And they were protesting against the Diem regime, the leadership that we were supporting in Vietnam. With collusion from the United States, basically we knew that Diem was going to be assassinated, and we basically gave the green light, and there was a military coup. We didn't kill him, but we stood back and allowed him to be killed. So there's going to be a change of leadership, and it turns out that this is going to begin a revolving door of military leaders in Vietnam, each of whom is just as incompetent as the one before him. Diem, as corrupt as he was, it turns out he was probably the better leader we ever saw during our time that we were involved in Vietnam. Kennedy, meanwhile, just about a week after Diem is killed, Kennedy is shot down by a sniper in Dallas. There has often been some speculation about whether those two events were connected. No proof of it. McNamara declared that Kennedy had planned complete withdrawal by December 1965. There's always been this argument, would Kennedy have gotten us more involved or less? This is what Robert McNamara said. Kennedy planned complete withdrawal. The first one's going out in '63, and then a public announcement to make the total withdrawal firm. But of course, Kennedy's not in charge anymore. So here's McNamara in 1964. The U.S. role in South Vietnam then is to answer the call of the South Vietnamese, to help them save their country for themselves, to help prevent the strategic danger which would exist if communism absorbed Southeast Asia's people and resources. And third, to prove the Vietnamese test case that the free world can cope with communist wars of liberation. So now, Vietnam is also a test case. This is a laboratory where we're going to see if the techniques we're using are the way to check or to stop communism, the spread of communism. 1964, there's an incident that it turns out, with evidence that's been brought up ever since that event, this is partly fabrication. It's reported that in the Gulf of Tonkin, international waters off the coast of Vietnam, that PT boats attacked a US warship on 2 successive nights. As it turns out, as best historians and others can conclude, there was an attack by a minor vessel on a major US vessel the first night. Nobody was hurt, but there was an attack documented. The second night, there was no attack at all. It was reported there was an attack. And this was used as the basis for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. LBJ wanted a chance to take action in Vietnam. One thing I should say about this Gulf of Tonkin incident is what our warship was doing was providing communications for a covert operation. We were part of an operation going on in North Vietnam. We were supporting that covert operation. So we were in international waters, but we were up to something, if you will. And now we use this as the basis to begin Operation Rolling Thunder, because JFK will get the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that lets him use forces and money to protect American interests. So we begin secret bombing raids. China will mass troops on the Vietnam border. The Viet Cong will attack one of our air bases. And so if you're going to have planes in Vietnam involved in a bombing campaign, you've got to protect the planes. So Westmoreland requests Marines to protect Da Nang Air Base. So we have, in March of '65, 3,500 Marines arrive to protect our airfields. Well, it doesn't take a genius to figure out if you just sit in an encircled area and wait for the enemy to come to you, the enemy's going to come to you and lob mortars and do other things to you. A more effective way of preventing them from bombing your airplanes or mortaring your airplanes on the tarmac is to go out after them, search and destroy missions. So now the Marines are not just protecting the air bases by sitting on the air bases, they're going out into the field. This is starting to sound like the Vietnam War at this point. American troops on the ground seeking out the enemy, and of course, a major bombing campaign underway. Battle of Ia-Drang Valley, the first major operation. If you've seen the Mel Gibson movie, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, it's about this, where we inserted a number of troops, not realizing that we were putting them right up against a major Vietnamese force, and this was a very bloody battle. One thing the movie doesn't tell you, but if you read more about this, you'll find out that it was, when this battle is over, more troops come in and they move to an evacuation zone in the following days, and they are shot to pieces, going to landing zone Albany, I believe it is, and they are going to run into a terrible battle and will take a lot of casualties there. And if anybody here who served over there can add or correct to this, at the end, I would like you to do so. If I make a mistake, correct it, okay? 1965, 44 more combat battalions sent, our troop strength 125,000. Our news reporters start to travel with the troops when they show some of our troops basically putting a village to the torch, basically using Zippo lighters, lighting these very flammable hutches. There's a fair amount of protest because people don't see the enemy. They see people being burned out of their homes. Now, these were being used by the enemy to hide goods and to take refuge at night and so forth. So there was an argument to do this, but people, not everyone had the stomach to see some of the realities of war. So anti-war rallies start to spring up. We see 40 in American cities. This is 1965. 66, by now our ongoing bombing campaign has seen a lot of losses in terms of planes and airmen. While we're attacking targets that are well defended I might add, by Russian missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, we have a lot of pilots who are taken to the Hanoi Hilton. They're paraded through Hanoi, and when I say the Hilton, of course, that's a facetious term given to the compound there, the prison. Our U.S. troop levels now 389,000 at year end, at 66. 67, we begin bombing Haiphong Harbor. This is something we're escalating. We were afraid to do things earlier because we didn't want to provoke war. We didn't want to get the Chinese to come rushing in as they did in North Korea. We didn't want to invite retaliation by the Russians by blowing up their ships. So we did this in measured steps, but we start bombing the harbor. Westmoreland's requesting 200,000 more men. LBJ agrees only to 45,000. So our year-end troop number is 463,000. The enemy strength is somewhere around 300,000, estimate, we really don't know. Combat deaths to date, 16,000. Now that's a lot of men and women, but mind you, this is 1967. The final number is going to be over 58,000. So if you ask yourself at some point, at what point might we have stopped this? How many lives on our side would have been saved? How many lives in Vietnam might have been saved? So the idea here to withdraw or to end this war was what some people were arguing for, but most Americans at this point still believed we were there to stop the advance of communism. We were there because of what the communists had done to Vietnamese people, terrible things in the North that we reported on. So it was still, in the eyes of many people, a just war, a good war, if there's such a good thing as a good war, okay? But McNamara knew things were going badly and he resigned. Paris peace talks, did I skip a slide here? No, okay. Paris peace talks begin and immediately stall. And the seriousness or lack of seriousness about these peace talks could be seen, if you recall, they stopped the peace talks at one point because they couldn't agree on the shape of the table, whether the table should be round or rectangular, and that broke off the peace talks. Westmoreland is replaced. And now the protests in the United States are really ramped up. The Democratic National Convention takes place in Chicago in '68. You know, Mayor Daley was in charge in Chicago. And this is when the protesters, the Students for Democratic Society, go in and try and disrupt the convention, and Daley unleashes the police and National Guard on them in what has been called by scholars, by historians since then, a police riot. A lot of people saw this on TV, live, and this is, again, part of what's changing people's minds, seeing what's happening during these protests. Operation Rolling Thunder ends, 922 aircraft have been shot down. This is a peak year in many ways in the war. '68, the siege of Khe Sanh, where basically LBJ said, we'll hold on to that. This was supposed to be, in the minds of many, and probably in the minds of the North Vietnamese, this was supposed to be our Dien Bien Phu. And LBJ was not going to let that happen. And we used as many aircraft as we could get in the air, defending that air base. And so we held out. And then once the enemy withdrew, then we abandoned Khe Sanh. And this was kind of Vietnam in a microcosm. We fought, we had men hurt, we had men killed to defend this piece of ground. And then once the enemy withdrew, we withdrew and left that piece of ground. We were told, the American people were told that we were winning the war, finally. And it was just after that that the Tet Offensive takes place. Over 100 different locations in South Vietnam attacked during the Tet holiday. And Americans at that point, having been told we're winning the war, having seen on the news all these things of the deaths of so many people, having seen the struggles and the cost, and now after being told we're winning, having this major offensive in the South, this is when it changed in a lot of people's minds, including Walter Cronkite. And that was a huge moment when on the news he basically gave up on this war, if you will. Meanwhile, if you're looking for evidence that the enemy forces were not, bringing milk and honey to the Vietnamese people, 3,000 enemies of the people were executed just in the city of Hue alone. The My Lai massacre takes place in 1968, although Americans won't find out about it just yet. Johnson announces he won't run. He is worn down by this war. He hasn't found a solution. He thinks it's likely he will lose the election coming up, so he announces he won't run. And you can see he bids Hanoi join in peace talks. This is when Nixon takes office. He authorizes the bombing of Cambodia. Troop levels will peak under Nixon in '69 at 543,000. This is when the famous Battle of Hamburger Hill takes place, which is another case where our troops fight, I believe it's for 3 days, trying to take this hill at great cost. There's a movie about this if you haven't seen it. And that when we finally take the hill, then we leave, we abandon it. It's winning real estate at great cost, only to leave it to the enemy. The My Lai massacre is exposed in '69, and anti-protesters, 250,000 strong, gather in Washington. In '69, in November, Nixon announces what he had said was his secret strategy, the Vietnamization of the war. Basically, we will withdraw our troops gradually and turn the war over to the Vietnamese. We've adopted a plan which we have worked out in cooperation with the South Vietnamese for the complete withdrawal of U.S. combat ground forces and their replacement by South Vietnamese forces on an orderly timetable. Now you could ask, well, why didn't this happen from the very get-go? Why did we need to send our troops at all if their troops could do it? And I guess different reasons would be offered. They needed the training, they lacked the leadership and so forth. But this is now Nixon's plan to get us out. '69. 1970, Kissinger begins his 2 years of secret talks. We invade Cambodia. This is the year that at Kent State, during a protest, National Guardsmen opened fire and kill 4 students at Kent State and wound 9 others. The Senate is souring on this whole war. They repeal the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and they pass an appropriation bill that forbids the use of ground troops in neighboring countries, Laos or Cambodia. That's in '70. Now, I've gone through all this as words. What those of you who lived during these times, didn't go to the war, I'm going to show you some images. You'll have seen some of them. For those of you who went there, I'm sorry if you find these disturbing, because I recognize the significance of PTSD, and I hope that I won't cause any problems in that respect. These are just some pictures from this time. These would be South Vietnamese troops. This is a shot taken by Larry Burroughs, Life magazine photographer, who was killed in a helicopter crash in Vietnam. This is a hand grenade booby trap. You walk down a path. Imagine trying to not see a thin wire in the jungle grass, right? This is one way that troops are ambushed. These are punji stakes. These would be covered over. They'd be covered with human excrement to poison anybody that had the unfortunate experience of falling on one of these sticks. These would be North Vietnamese troops. Traveled light, moved fast. They were great soldiers, actually, in terms of their abilities. This would be an anti-aircraft missile, probably up around Hanoi. This is an incident during the Tet Offensive where the chief of police in Saigon executes a captive. This was also captured on video and played live on the news in the United States, but actually the picture, which captures the very moment the bullet striking this man, actually had more impact for many people, because it's captured in time like this. This is during the Battle of Hue. You might ask people who served there what they think, if any movies do justice to the war. Some talk about, one covers the Battle of Hue in particular, and I've heard veterans say that particular one. Scott, can you help me out? The movie that's covers the Battle of Way. Well, Full Metal Jacket. A lot of veterans think that's a significant movie. This again is fight for the Battle of Way, fight for the city of Way. This gives you an idea of what a hilltop can look like after a battle and after bombardment. This would be My Lai. What you see here is they're using the rifle to smoke, to use drugs, basically. Drugs became a significant problem the more the war went on. One thing that I'm not sure comes across in any of these slides is early on, the people who served tended to be volunteers. But then as the need for more and more men, the call went out, not only for more volunteers, but the draft started. And you may remember the ping pong balls and the numbers. And the ping pong ball could, in the long run, determine somebody's fate. And so as more and more people were drafted and went to Vietnam, not because they volunteered to be there, not out of a sense of patriotism or duty, but they were there because their government sent them there, greater problems tended to come into play. Motive, morale, and drug use. Towards the end of the war, drug use was a much more severe problem than earlier in the war. I have some slides now just about what's going on here in the States. Here's a slide, an interesting one about opinion. Was it a mistake to send US troops? And you see back in '65, about 25% said it was a mistake, about a quarter of the country. By '72, that number is up around 60%. So that's when I started by saying the changing perception of this war. Was it a good war gone bad, or was it a case that this was never a good war? It's just people found out more about how we got there, or people learned more about what it was like to be in a war. Of course, World War II, our dads or grandfathers, depending on your age, they knew war, but the American people sending their husbands and sons and brothers and daughters over there had a different view of it, obviously changing during these war years. The protests went from being protests on college campuses to being huge protests in cities. These are shots, of course, you remember, I'm sure, from the Kent State shootings. 1971, just to catch you up, we are bombing in Laos and Cambodia. The Vietnam Veterans Against the War have formed, and they are now very active in the protests. This is also when the last Marine combat units depart. And you can see, in terms of morale, the 1st Air Cavs, some members refuse to go out on patrol at this point, because who wants to be the last man killed in a war? The Pentagon Papers were published in '71. You may have different feelings of the Pentagon Papers. Daniel Ellsberg, these were papers he was put in jail for taking. These are papers that the president tried to stop different newspapers, and when one would be stopped, another one would pick it up, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and so forth. And word got out. This was illegal, this was the theft of government documents, but this turned out to be very important in telling the American people how we got in and what had happened behind the scenes. And people concluded what they suspected all along, many people, and that is, we had been lied to by our government. And so the troops who went over, many of them to fight for a good cause, to fight on behalf of their country, and then they felt like they didn't get the support of their leaders, of the politicians. Troop levels dropped to 156,071. Here's Vietnam vets against the war. That was John Kerry testifying in front of Congress. And one thing I point out, there's this notion, this cliche out there that war protesters were all these young, long-haired hippies on drugs. Some protesters were young, long-haired hippies on drugs, but as I'll show you, many, many were not. 1972 is when that terrible incident where the South Vietnamese planes bombed their own people by mistake. We boycott the Paris peace talks. North Vietnamese begin a major offensive. President Tu, the president of South Vietnam, denounces Kissinger's peace proposal. Nixon is reelected in a landslide. And our Christmas bombings are denounced by other politicians and the press. In '73, the president of South Vietnam is forced to accept a peace agreement that allows North Vietnamese troops to remain in South Vietnam. He knows this is the handwriting on the wall. There's going to be no stopping them. Nixon announces the agreement has been reached that will end the war and bring peace with honor. So we sign the peace accords. Hanoi releases our prisoners of war. The last American troops withdraw. And then the Case-Church Amendment makes sure that we will not get re-involved militarily in Southeast Asia. You know the Watergate story. 74, Nixon has to resign. Ford announces clemency for draft evaders. But meanwhile, the North Vietnamese are engaged in a major offensive. Ford says, we're not going to go back in there. We're not going to do what we have to stop them. Although we had pledged we would continue to support the South Vietnamese. So they begin this mass exodus. People in South Vietnam, particularly soldiers and people who had worked with us, with our government, trying to get out before these guys come in. April 21st, I'm sure you've seen this picture at some point. This is the helicopter taking people off the embassy roof. President Tu resigns and condemns the peace accords and Henry Kissinger and condemns the US, saying the United States has not respected its promises. It's inhumane, it's untrustworthy, it is irresponsible. And in they come. The North Vietnamese arrive and take over the city. And here's some numbers looking. In terms of number of personnel, you can see there's a bell curve for you, with 1968 being the peak year, over 500,000 men and women, American men and women serving in Vietnam. Death toll, these numbers are all rough. These are estimates, of course. Over 2 million civilians, over 1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters, 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers, 58,220 Americans, with some still accounted for. Nearly 5,000 Allied forces who fought in Vietnam with us. South Koreans, Thais, Australians, and New Zealand troops. US casualties, of the 58,220 killed at the time that these numbers were generated, 86% were white, 12.5% black. So there's an argument that the more African Americans were drafted than whites. What the meaning here is proportionally more African Americans were drafted than whites were drafted, proportionate to their overall population, and a higher percentage of them died. 61% of US war dead were younger than 21. This is something I try and impress on the students in my classes at Coastal. I just point to them and say, this means you. If you were 22 years old in Vietnam, you were probably a second lieutenant. You were an old man compared to a lot of the people with you. 70% of the men killed were volunteers. 17,000 of them, more than 17,000, were married. 6,500 officers, 50,000 enlisted men. 114 men died in captivity. Here by year, this is the same bell curve as the number of people. You can see 68 being the peak year in terms of deaths. This is interesting. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but there might be some surprises here. Hostile deaths, 47,000. Remember, we're talking about 58,000 men and women who died over there. Non-hostile deaths, over 10,000. Accident killed some 9,000 troops over there. Accident. You can see died of wounds, 5,200. Well, one thing about the medical care, it was extraordinary. The dust off, the chopper pilots who would come in under heavy fire, under extraordinarily perilous situations, to get the wounded out and to get them to these hospitals, whether they're field hospitals or back at headquarters, and get them care as quickly as possible, saved so many lives that the survival rate in this war was higher than it would have been in probably any previous war. You can see illness killed over 900, and self-inflicted wounds, 382. Now that's how many died from self-inflicted wounds. How many other men might have had a wound that maybe would get them out of the war doesn't show up on this. In terms of wounds, 304 servicemen wounded. Now those would not include PTSD. And if you look at that as a war injury, that number would be extraordinarily high, much higher than that. Veterans, 23,000 plus were 100% disabled. Over 5,000 lost limbs. Over 1,000 had multiple amputations. Survey suggests that at least 11% of veterans have PTSD. I think that number increases every time they look at it. And at least 430 veterans have died from complications with Agent Orange. And those are the ones that can be proved. You can't prove where a cancer comes from sometimes, many times, and whether Agent Orange, you don't have to be up in a helicopter or a plane dumping Agent Orange or working with it on a base. If you're in the jungle where Agent Orange has been dumped, then you are exposed to it. Medical care, again, I've talked about the medical care was extraordinary. Average time lapse from injury to hospitalization, less than 1 hour. And less than 1% of men who survived the first 24 hours died. That's extraordinary. If we put up a chart of the Civil War, I know that seems like a strange comparison, but when you teach American history as I do, and you're covering all these wars, and you look at the chances if a man gets shot in the arm or the leg in the Civil War, there's a very good chance he's going to die after they saw his arm or leg off in a field hospital without anesthesia. In this case, if they could get you to a base, there's a good chance you're going to live. 15 Army medics received the Medal of Honor. You saw a picture of one of them earlier giving mouth-to-mouth in the field, young man from Massachusetts. Financial cost, $168 billion total, according to the Department of Defense. Look at the third line, $28.5 billion on economic and military aid to the Saigon regime. $2.6 billion in aid to the French isn't even included in those numbers. Isn't it interesting that after the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, they wanted nothing to do with what was going on in Vietnam, and they condemned U.S. presence there and operations there. The air war, this is a map. The black is showing where there were air strikes. Rather extraordinary. We dropped 6.1 million tons of bombs, 3 times the bombs we dropped in World War II. Extraordinary, considering the size of Vietnam compared to the areas of operation, the theaters of operation in World War II. Okay. 500 jets lost attacking the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we dropped 20 million gallons of herbicides. And now I just want, again, to take a quick look at the people for the war and against the war, just in pictures. Because there were people right up to the very end who supported the war, certainly people with sons and daughters there who wanted to support them. But over time, they became increasingly outshouted, overwhelmed by the opposition forces. Down with peaceniks. There was the Hard Hat Riot in New York City in May 1970. Come on. Okay, I think leftists are the new Nazis. And then a look at some of the anti-war. And this is, I said earlier, the idea that everybody against the war was a long-haired, drug-addicted hippie. Not quite accurate, as some of these pictures will show. Them, maybe. GIs for peace. That might be Benjamin Spock right in front there. Pardon me? And I believe this is my final slide showing we lifted the embargo partially in 94. 95, we normalized relations and fully lifted the embargo in 2014. So that's a lot to cover. And as I told you, I wasn't going to try to tell you what it was like being in the jungles of Vietnam. I wasn't there. I don't want to impose on your time, but if I could, I'd like to welcome any of the veterans in the room to come up for a couple of minutes and just say anything you'd like to, whether it's about your experience or your feelings.
I'll just stay right here.
Okay.
Just a couple of points.
Well, would you tell us your name, please?
Richard Cullerton,
Richard.
and we live in Hidden Oaks in Follies. A couple of things. Number one, I was in the Navy in the mid-60s, 65 and 67, and had a tour in the Da Nang area and in the Mekong Delta near the Cambodian border. When I got home in 1967, my dad asked me all about the war. And because I was only in one unit in one place in Da Nang, and one unit in one place in the Mekong Delta, that's what I knew. He, on the other hand, this was a televised television war, maybe the first television war. He knew everything, and I knew nothing compared to him. So that caused me to start a decades-long study of the Vietnam War, starting with the French experience, the French Indochina War, and later with our experience. And I would say, based on this decades-long study that I've done and the book that captures it mostly, in my opinion, the Stanley Carnot's book, Vietnam, A History, your presentation was right on target. I could not quibble with anything that you presented here. In fact, I learned a few things that I didn't know. The other thing I would say is my wife and I, Muffy, went back to Vietnam in 1968 and went on an overseas adventure. 2018. 2018, sorry. And it was quite an experience. Could never have visited in 1965 and worked our way down the coast and ended up in the Mekong Delta. And after the 18-day trip was over, we hired a local Vietnamese with a car to take us to the little town in the Mekong Delta where I had been stationed. that was set up by a Vietnamese friend who had a relative there who provided these services for visiting Americans. And I guess in 50-word or less summary, the Vietnam of 2018 and the Vietnam of 1965 are like two different worlds. Population has pretty much doubled. I think I saw one statistic where there are 100 million motor scooters and there's no traffic control, and there's chaos in action, yet we never saw an accident. Saigon now has something in the order of 10 to 15 million people. Da Nang, at the time we were there, had one bridge over the Da Nang River, which we worked to make sure it stayed in service. And today there are 5. And the population in Da Nang went from, like, I think an estimated 100,000 in 1965 to over 1 million today. So the country has changed completely. And the other comment I would have is that it may be communist, but if you walk around the shops in Saigon, they call it Saigon, even though it's today officially Ho Chi Minh City. If you walk around the shops, you'd suddenly realize that that's the biggest capitalist economy you'd ever want to see. You could buy anything you wanted, from cars to jewelry to televisions, etc. So it's a very different country today. But your presentation was outstanding.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to hear from anybody else who.
Okay. Well, Robert and I are here. What was interesting, I came in late on your talk, so I didn't catch the first part of it. But there's no mention of the land clearing teams that were run by the Army engineers. I don't know if you even know anything about the Army engineers.
I know of their existence. I really didn't, in terms of operations, I think everybody here would tell you, I didn't try to tell you about individual units or different, I didn't talk about helicopter pilots, I didn't, except the medics, and that's a different kind of talk.
I see a lot of videos on YouTube. Just the other day, I was looking at a video called Gun Trucks of Vietnam. Very popular subject, if you will. One of the things, I had watched these videos maybe 3 or 4 months ago. I put one back up on screen the other day and watched it again. What I realized as I'm watching that video, the ground around, I think it was QL-19 where this video was taken. All of the ground around QL-19 has been cleared. That was us. That was the land clearing teams. I was there early on. Robert was there in 71? 69, 70. The 501st turned over their equipment to the Armins in those days. Now, I have to admit, there is a video about the organization of the land clearing teams, and I'll be damned if he's not in it. I've got to get him to look at it and take a good close look at it. But there's some blonde kid, right age, right place. I'm not sure if it's him.
Well, thank you both for your service.
But like I say, Robert and I are part of a committee right now. We're trying to get some recognition for the land clearing teams. We ran from 1960, the early land clearing teams were in 65, ran all the way through 1971. And there's not a damn thing out there other than old Army archive films about some of the land clearing teams. And what we have come to the conclusion, the casualties for Vietnam, 58 and change. If we hadn't been clearing land, I would guarantee you that that number is 150. brought a lot of people home because of what we did. My oldest son is married to a girl whose father went through the infantry. He came home because of what we did, based on his comments.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of people who owe you a debt they don't even realize that they owe you, but thank you for that. I do show in my classes, I do use videos. A lot of times there'll be videos that were produced by the government or videos produced within units. They'll follow a unit for several days, for example. And so students will get some kind of on the ground kind of feeling from the latter kind of unit. The ones from the government can actually make you angry or make you laugh, depending on your mood at the time. When you watch a video where the government comes out with a "why we're there" kind of propaganda piece, and then you watch it now, knowing what we know now, and you want to yell at the TV sometimes or whatever you're watching, and we learn from our experience. It'd be interesting to talk to folks who served over in Iraq and Afghanistan and say, what do you think is different because of what we learned in Vietnam? We didn't learn all the lessons we had to learn, but we learned some of them. So thank you. Was there somebody behind you who also served who was going to say something? Please. Yeah.
I'd like to talk to you afterwards.
Sure.
Well, I'm Gary Mack, retired in Pawleys Island. I was in a combat situation, but I was in combat areas. I was with the American Forces Vietnam Network, radio TV network, and I was on Bungie and Bung Chua Mountain overlooked Quinh Nhan, South China Sea. I was there about a half year, and then I was transferred to Saigon for the network station, the American Vietnam Network. I was a morning disc jockey. I did some television sportscasting. Saigon, I was a newscaster on AFN radio and sometimes did TV sports. If you watch the movie Good Morning Vietnam with Robin Williams, that's where I was stationed. There's some distortions in that. So in 1971, 1972, I left when the troop level was down to about 69,000, so I was glad I left Constitute Air Force Base and got out of there. There was a book published earlier this year called Hot Mics and TV Lights, which is all about American Forces Vietnam Network. And somehow I spotted myself in the back in a picture holding a coffee. This was outside the network station in Saigon, holding a coffee cup and an M16. So I was a little mixed on what my role was. We were supposed to be doing guard duty, and I think I did some of it. It was Tet of 1972, but not that much happened. So that was my role.
But you made your contribution. Thank you for that. You know, yeah, go ahead.
On your slides, you brought up the training of the South Vietnamese military. I was part of training the ARBANs for land clearing. And there's a big, I guess, faux pas that the ARBANs were really good military people. The people I trained, you have to understand, you're in a D70 Caterpillar tractor inside a steel cage with a blade that's taller than me, probably 8 foot wide, comes out with a stinger. With the first sound of a gunshot, they jump out and run down the road and then get shot. They were probably the worst military people that I ever saw as far as trying to train to defend their own country. I don't think their military had their heart in defending country, because once the North Vietnamese started coming in, they'd be tail and ran. They just dropped their weapons, ran, changed their clothes, and said, "Hey, how you doing?" So there's some investigation that really needs to go on there, because I worked with them, and it really wasn't a pleasant experience.
Well, we did make it worth their while financially to serve, which meant their hearts might not.
Brand new equipment, we still work with our old stuff.
Their hearts might not be in it, but as long as they were getting a good paycheck every month, then you don't want to get shot, you just want the paycheck, right? Yeah. One thing that you reminded me of with in talking about the reporting, one big issue that I think comes up in that movie with Robin Williams is the whole body count issue, where American commanders were really pushed, coerced, pressured to kill more and more, make the numbers look good. Okay, because it was said that for every one American who was killed, 10 enemy troops would be killed. And so we needed numbers that supported that kind of thinking, because this was supposedly a war of attrition. The argument was made that they would run out of men. They would run out of troops because we were killing them in such great numbers. And of course that didn't happen, but that was an argument, and I'm sure that certainly the people who served there and many others who just know about the war know that this kind of thinking that we need good numbers, and so you start getting people reporting false numbers or doing things. I have my students read a lot of things, and the expression any dead Vietnamese is any dead Vietnamese person is I don't want to use an inappropriate term, is an NVA or a Viet Cong, right? If they're dead, that means they were an enemy. Even if it's a 12-year-old girl, that's an enemy, and that contributes to the body count. And it was that kind of thinking that contributed to the overall problem, which was our government wanted this to be a justifiable war that we would win, or we would at least end on honorable terms. And things just kept piling up on the other side of that, working against that. And so these people who were pressured to come up with these numbers just became part of the problem. You meet people, and there are such terrible stories. I worked with a fellow in Boston. He was a good friend, and we went out drinking once, and he after quite a number of drinks, he told me about, he was a grunt. He was just out, one of many men on patrol, and his unit got a new NCO or cherry first lieutenant, or maybe second lieutenant, and he told them to march down the road. You two would probably know better, okay? And they, not to march, but to walk down the road. And they said, no, we aren't going to go on the road, because that's where they're going to have planted booby traps. And he insisted, now he's giving a military command, he insisted they go on the road. And sure enough, one of them hit a mine and got killed. And this guy, Michael, that I'm out drinking with, told me, so that night, I went outside the officers' quarters and I lobbed a grenade in there. And he killed the guy. And Mike went, I guess he was on his way to Leavenworth, but he was jailed and got off on some kind of technicality. And I just think about that story. I'm sure Mike was not a bad guy when he got drafted to go over there. But this war put him in a situation where his friend got killed for obeying an order that the person giving the order, I'm sure he thought that he was making the right decision, and it all ends up with several people being killed and American forces killing American forces, and it's just one horrific story of how many thousands of horrific stories from the war. And so it's a war that they didn't even want to call it a war, right? And it's something that there's so many lessons. When I teach students, I have a whole semester to teach them. So I'm not sure even in a full semester I would ever have mentioned what your unit did, because there's so many different people, different roles. But there's a lot more to be said, and I would welcome that conversation to continue. Did you have a question?
Yeah, what about Jane Fonda?
Hanoi Jane?
Yeah, Hanoi Jane.
Well, it's one thing to have been a war protester. It's another to go over and sit at a anti-aircraft gun or missile in Hanoi. And so many Americans hated her with good reason. Protesters should not be reviled for opposing the war, but your behavior, what you do about your convictions, says a lot about you, and she went way beyond the pale.
And she got away with it.
Yeah, she did. Well, if she wasn't Jane Fonda, maybe things would have been different. Yeah. Yes?
Part of the reason that the body count, as you want to call it, for the enemy, Vietcong, NVA, was they had a habit of taking their dead with them when they after a battle or towards the end of a battle, they knew they were losing. They gathered up their dead and took them with them. So when our troops would go in to see what had happened, they may find a few bodies, but the majority of them are gone.
So we started stacking weapons and counting weapons.
Weapons were with them. They didn't leave weapons behind.
Yeah. But I've seen the weapons counts, body counts, both being reported. And of course, no man left behind, right?
Yeah. So, it worked both ways.
Yeah. Any other questions? I know we've run over. Yes?
Could we have won?
Could we have won? Well, what's winning? If we could have continued to fight that war as long as we wanted, but never. There's the hearts and minds argument. You can control a country, but if you aren't controlling if you're not winning over their hearts and their minds, then you're in permanent war. Could the British have won the American Revolution? They could have fought on and on and on, but they got tired of pouring money and men into a war that clearly the Americans were going to continue to fight. There was no end in sight. And the British Parliament said, that's enough. King George wanted to continue the war. Parliament said, no, enough is enough. Could we have continued to bomb and shoot and sent troops over? Yes. Could we have won? Have we won in Afghanistan? Have we won in Iraq? I mean, what's victory? Probably the victory that eluded us was we could have divided Vietnam like Korea was divided in 1956, or we could have stepped back and said, let them decide for themselves, and if they're going to become a communist nation, so be it. That's their choice. Would that be a victory for us? Not in the thinking of the time. In retrospect, that might have been the best thing to do. But could we have defeated them militarily? Ask the people, who's the enemy? How do you tell a Viet Cong from a Vietnamese civilian? And how do you stop the people in North Vietnam and the Viet Minh, the NVA? How do you stop them from wanting self-liberation and independence? You don't. So I think there's a big answer to your question is probably not. I don't think victory was something, militarily we had the force to dominate, but victory has to take a different shape other than just military domination. Yes.
I'm writing something up from back in the, when I was in undergrad school in the early 70s, but I was a history major. And of course, being of the generation that a lot of friends I grew up with in Dobbs Ferry, New York, and Ardsley, New York, they were drafted and came back terribly changed. Some of them never recovered. But in my history, as I was trying to research everything and understand the history of Vietnam, something I read, and I could be totally wrong about it, but was that the Ho Chi Minh and Mao were only friends by convenience. The Vietnamese and the Chinese had, hundreds of years of where they were not friends. But, it's kind of like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they got support militarily and all that from the People's Republic of China. But a lot of Americans were afraid that, China would go down and everything, take all that off. But Ho Chi Minh would have fought that too because there was no love lost there. So their communist country would not have followed Mao's communist country, which is what kind of, this is going back years trying to dredge up what I had read.
Well, Ho Chi Minh was a communist member. In fact, he was instrumental in getting the whole communist Indochina movement going. But he, as you correctly recall, he was not married to either the Russian or the Chinese communists. And he used, exploited is maybe too strong a word, but he used his alliances, his connections, the things that they agreed on to his advantage. I mean, he got support from both of those countries during his war, but his war was a war of liberation for the Vietnamese people. It wasn't a, come on in, Russia, you're in charge now. I've never thought about this comparison, but if we looked at Cuba, Castro became best buddies with the Russians, but it was never Khrushchev calling the shots in Cuba. It was Castro, a very strong dictator in Cuba, who was a communist and had strong alliances. And so I think there's good reason to believe that certainly Ho Chi Minh, had he been fairly elected, as he probably would have been in 1956, it would have continued as a communist nation. A good question is there anything to the domino theory? Well, if the communists continued to pursue their agenda in other countries, that possibility existed, except if Laos or Cambodia or Thailand was going to go over to communism, it wasn't going to be because of the fall of Vietnam. They had their own separate histories and accounts and leadership. And so I think we have to look at them not as a bloc, but as independent nations. One thing nobody ever talks about, somebody could correct me maybe here, one of the reasons that we were so interested in maintaining a presence and influence in Vietnam was because of Japan. Well, what is that all about? We had defeated Japan militarily. We had reduced them, pounded them down, and we were in control in Japan, right? MacArthur goes over. We established American control in Japan, and our goal was to have them rebuild as a strong ally and a semi-democratic nation, okay? I mean, their culture went against democratic rule, but we wanted to rebuild them in something acceptable to us and the American people, and also to serve as a strong ally. Japan needed resources from Southeast Asia. That was one of their main markets prior to the Second World War. So we wanted to make sure that that channel of goods, of materials, continued. If Vietnam becomes a communist nation and Japan is allied to us, then that becomes a problem for Japan, and the possibility of them falling into the communist orbit is raised exponentially. So, I mean, I don't know how many of you ever, this idea that France practically blackmails us, I don't know if that comes as old news to you or if that's something that you're just learning for the first time. And this whole thing with Japan and the need to provide Japan with their resources, that's something that there's so many pieces in this puzzle. You know, you put these as the pins on the board in the cop shows, and you've got strings and notes going everywhere. And it's a very complicated story. Yeah.
Another thing was when you said FDR, you know, he'd come out with that statement of what he wanted to happen.
Right.
Of course, in April of '45, he died, but and when he went to the conference, you know, the Potsdam conference, he was sickly. Right. He was, of course, he had been, you know, crippled and all that, but he was mentally, was not with it at right. that time. And then Truman, he kept Truman out of the loop. He wasn't like, he never brought Truman into any meetings. Truman kind of came in like not knowing what he was supposed to do when he became president, when FDR died. So had FDR been good mental and continued through another year or so, do you think he would have fought? De Gaulle would not have let De Gaulle, because De Gaulle was not liked by the American troops and by our government at all. So would he have fought him on that, do you think?
Allow me to call in our resident expert. Scott, can you answer that question to the best of your ability? Scott, as I said, is a colleague of mine. Scott has paid far more attention, done more research on the French and Vietnam than I'll do in the rest of my life. So Scott, can you address that?
Well, Roosevelt constantly had to modify his opinion about what to do with the French. Because
Could
once
you
the
stand
Second
up,
World War
please?
was over,
Could
we
you stand up so we can hear?
Because Roosevelt, they didn't know what was going to happen once the Second World War was over, because at Yalta, that's when Roosevelt was sick. And we have no idea what he promised Stalin, because like you said, Truman had no idea about it. So Truman takes over. And the problem is, it became very apparent a few months after the Second World War was over, the Russians were going to be a problem. The Nazis had been defeated.
Patton was right.
If he used calmer language, made things a little different. But yeah, the determination, because, as George Kennan pointed out, who had served there in Moscow as a diplomat, that the Russians, their attitude was they were not going to cooperate with capitalist countries. But, so Roosevelt probably, when they realized the problem with the Russians, because he modified his ideas about the French and, their colonies. But key thing when Truman takes over is he realized France wants to put back their empire they came. They've been humiliated by the Second World War. We need them for European defense. And part of what comes into something called the European Defense Community, while the United States really gets involved in Indochina, is we want to rearm the West Germans. We want to put guns in the hands of West Germans. The French, they don't want to see a German with a gun ever again. So the French proposed something called the European Defense Community, create an international army. And there would be German elements of this. As long as the United States, like John pointed about, blackmail, that was part of it, that we would finance them, continue to keep them fighting. And then, of course, they declared it was a war against communism, was about reestablishing colonialism any longer. So Truman went along with that because the world was on fire pretty quick after the Second World War. You had the Civil War going on in Greece. Looks like the communists were on the move everywhere. And one of the reasons, of course, the Russians were interested in supplying the North Vietnamese and the Chinese help with the Viet Minh, because Mao was getting help from the Russians. They wanted him to be involved in East Asia, causing distractions, because it kept the Americans from paying attention to what was going on in Europe. And Stalin created, eventually the Warsaw Pact, which was a larger part of the Cold War, which was everywhere.
I told you it was complicated.
Oh, yeah, like you said, there's so many things that are tied together. And of course, what happens when the French lose the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, because who's going to build a base in the middle of a valley surrounded by mountains, at the full extent of your air transport capabilities, because they didn't have the air transport to fly that base for 1 day during the air force attack. They ran out of ammunition, artillery ammunition, for 2 days when the battle started.
I don't want anybody to feel awkward that they have to leave. So thank you all for coming. Thank you very much.